Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Jessica Gerard, Senior Lecturer here at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. We will commence the proceedings. So I might ask you all please to be upstanding for the arrival of Her Excellency, the Governor of Victoria, Mr. Anthony Howard and Professor Leslie Farrell.
To begin, I would like to acknowledge the elders, families and descendants of the Wurundjeri people who've been and are custodians of these lands. I acknowledge that the land on which we meet was the place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands and this university. Well, tonight we really are honoured to host the Governor of Victoria and Mr. Anthony Howard QC at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Her Excellency, the Honourable Linda Dessay, was sworn in as Victoria's 29th Governor on the 1st of July 2015. Was the first woman in the role. She attended the University of Melbourne, she's an alumni, where she gained a Bachelor of Laws with honours and was admitted as a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Victoria in 1975. The Governor had a distinguished career in the law, as well as being involved in a wide range of community organisations. Tonight, the Governor will present the October Lecture in a special edition of our 2017 Dean's Lecture Series. And I've asked my colleague, Dr. Jessica Gerard, Senior Lecturer in Education, Equity and Politics, to move a vote of thanks at the conclusion of the lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Her Excellency, the Governor of Victoria.
Let me just start by acknowledging Professor Leslie Farrell, the Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, all members of faculty, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. And may I join too in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathering, and by paying my respects to their elders past and present, and any elders who are with us this evening. I am absolutely delighted to join you here to deliver this Dean's Lecture. Well, that's partially true. I'm sort of delighted. I was full of enthusiasm when I received the invitation, but then I actually thought about it, and I have absolutely no expertise on this topic. Professor Rickards, an old friend and the one who invited me to speak, comforted me, or more accurately, attempted to comfort me, that is shortly before he hightailed it out of Melbourne, so he wasn't here tonight, by referring me to previous Dean's lectures to read. He assured me that they would give me the flavour and set me on the right path. Well, they certainly gave me a flavour of what had gone before. I saw experts such as Jan van Driel, Professor in Chemical Engineering from Utrecht University, and Professor Anna Safard, Professor of Mathematical Education at the University of Haifa. And I saw topics such as learning about human learning, how to know more and why we will never know enough, or from earlier this year, thinking about the future, whether, when, why, how, who, what, and so what. The expertise of the speakers and the complexity of the subject matter were really quite daunting for someone with only a layman's perspective. So the only clarity for me was that I would not in any way attempt to talk to you from a position of expertise that I simply do not have. It wouldn't only be inauthentic, but the worst part is it would be obviously inauthentic. I can assure you this isn't said with any false humility on my part. In fact, it's not said with any humility at all. I'm cautious about expressing humility because I always think of the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir's response to her war general, Moshe Dayan, when she presented him with the medal and he said that he felt humbled to receive it. She replied, "Moshe, don't feel so humble, you're not that good." And so, steering clear of humility, I shall still be realistic and talk to you this evening quite simply from my own perspective, a perspective spread across decades as a student, a parent, a school counsellor, a children's court magistrate, a family court judge, and most particularly as the Governor of Victoria. Starting as a student, let me just assure you, I'm well aware that many of us, having been to school ourselves in our long ago childhoods, believe that instills in us great expertise when it comes to the modern day educational needs of our children and of our nation. And I have cautioned myself against taking that course of assuming that. I've also cautioned myself to avoid the temptation to start with and linger in any detail upon when I was at school. Save to say that when I was at school, it was the olden days, and I'm very conscious that much has changed. What hasn't changed, however, is that teachers matter the most when it comes to learning, and when a student is lucky enough to strike a particular rapport with a particular teacher, truly wonderful things can happen. New worlds can be opened, lives can change course. It's probably a good time for me to publicly thank Mrs. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling nurtured my love for English, for writing, for literature. And although she's no longer here for me to say this to her directly, I thought of her recently as I watched Belle Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. I was transported back to the charm and the enthusiasm with which she taught Shakespeare. I was in my intermediate year English class. The fact that I refer to intermediate proves to you it really was the olden days. And for many of you here, I should explain that's year 10. What I suspect has changed, though, from my days at school, but possibly still not quite enough, is the early channeling of students into the subjects that reflect their natural strengths. But I'm going to return to that topic a little later when I deal or touch upon the topic of polymaths. One final word about my own school days. They were not, as I hear other people quite often claim, they were not the best days of my life. I enjoyed them, but to my mind, any school that gives its students the best days of their lives has failed. Surely school should help set us up for a future life of very many bests. So as a parent, again, I won't linger long here. I think that although a parent is obviously one of the most important elements in a child's school experience, ironically, we can also be the least well-informed. As I've already noted, the fact that we went to school doesn't qualify us as educators, but nor does the fact that we know our own children better than anyone else. It doesn't necessarily qualify us to understand how best they learn, or how best to teach them, or how they act in a group. We need the proficiency of a teacher to bring their expertise to that task. And our expectations might not always be in step with reality, although our children happen to be incredibly bright and mature. I recall sitting in our local school's prep classroom at a parent-teacher interview early in our elder son's first year at school. Naturally, we were folded onto little 5-year-old chairs, as you are. After the teacher described her plans to us for the year for our children, she politely asked if anyone had any questions. "Yes," said one mother in a very assertive tone. "Why haven't you taught my child to read yet?" I was really struck by that question. There was just so much that was so terribly wrong with it. Forget the tone, which was passive-aggressive but bordering closely on aggressive-aggressive. Forget that it was still quite early in term 1 of prep. It was the shifting of the sole responsibility, of course, to the teacher that just struck me as so plainly wrong. I'm not sure if without that awkward moment I would have been as alive to the concept of partnership between school and home as I became when I reflected on why I had felt so offended by that question and that mum's tone of voice. It did make me reflect on how much I appreciated the central role of the teacher, whilst understanding that parents can't simply abdicate to teachers the full responsibility for their child's education. I became committed right there and then to the beautiful collaboration, the partnership between parents and teachers, believing that it's at the heart of the very best education. As a parent, I must say I learned a great deal from our local school. I learned about our local community and the importance of immersing our children in it. We've not lived in that neighbourhood for almost 20 years, but if our now adult children return, many shopkeepers and others greet them by their first names. What a lovely legacy from primary schooling. I also learned how much interested parents can contribute to their children's schools, whether in terms of their time, their skills or support. There are the mums and dads we all know, the ones who help run programs that simply couldn't be run without them, those who turn up for the working bees that significantly improve the school infrastructure, and the ones who volunteer in the office to free up resources in other parts of the school. And there are those who, like me, are serial recidivists when it comes to volunteering for creche, kindergarten, primary and secondary school councils. I suppose it was always hopefully to lend some governance skills to organisations that were often too small to buy in that expertise. And it was a wonderful way too for a full-time working parent to stay absolutely in touch with the place where her children spent so much of their time. As a Children's Court magistrate, I intersected with schools and teachers in many ways. In fact, my professional life as a magistrate, then a family court judge, and I was a family court judge for the last 18 years of my legal career, brought me into contact, obviously, with schools in so many different ways. Particularly in the role as a family court judge, I dealt with disputes where parents weren't capable to get their children to school, where children had faced the disruption of possibly 16 or 17 different changes of school, or where school was simply another battleground for warring parents. Some separating parents asked the court to intervene when they can't agree on which school would be right for their children. They'd get us to decide between state and private, special and mainstream, single-sex and co-ed, secular and non-secular, or sometimes just between two fantastic schools that a child would be fortunate to attend in either case, if only it weren't a fight between his or her parents. And then, of course, the whole area of extracurricular options opened a whole new ground of battle as well. I quickly realised, though, that school can in fact be the one safe place for some children, and teachers the one safety net. It might just be the place free from the sort of parental conflict that I've just described, the one place where a child can be assured of a nutritious breakfast, the place where he or she can find positivity, or the place where serious family issues can first be detected and the child protected. But I want to talk to you a little more this evening about what I've seen of education in my role as the Governor. It is certainly as the Governor that I've learned more about education than at any other time of my life. So if ever we talk about lifelong learning, you can get to these mature ages. And having hosted the Seniors Awards this morning at Government House, including giving an award to the most sprightly 99-year-old man, my husband and I feel very young this evening. But it's really the beauty and breadth of this role that brings so many new things into focus for us. The role of the Governor is traditionally described in three main parts: constitutional, ceremonial and community. The constitutional part involves the protection of the state constitution. And I must say I'm left in no doubt that as a community, we could certainly be better educated about our system. One of the longest continuous democracies in the world, something to be proud of. And we do need our youngsters to understand all the checks and balances that are built into our system, lest they unwittingly allow those protections to be eroded. There's the ceremonial part of the role. It includes presiding over important occasions such as Anzac Day and Australia Day and investing Australian honours. Again, I'm keen to emphasise the need for our young people to learn of the significance of such occasions and such awards. If we remember where we come from and we remember what's been sacrificed for us, then I think we're better equipped to know where we must head and what we must contribute to those coming behind us. And if we contemplate our heritage, our First Peoples, and all the waves of migrants that comprise our nation today, we might be at our best in respecting the differences of all those who live side by side. And certainly if we understand the Australian honours system, we might better understand the goodness, the cleverness and the generosity of others, and in turn, hopefully, be inspired to make similar contributions. The third part of the role is about the community. The Governor, from a totally apolitical position, represents all Victorians and works to be a cohesive force across suburbs and regions, age groups, occupational groups, interests, different community organisations, and of course promoting diversity of every sort. I have the privilege in this role of thanking and congratulating those who do great work, whether by clever industry of global import or generous volunteering at the most local level. My husband and I often comment, both coming from the courts, having both been judges, what a lovely change of career it is for us from taking, as you often have to do as a judge, whether it's people's money or children or liberty. And this role is very much about giving thanks and bringing people together. So it's a very positive role. From what I see, schools in Victoria, I must say, generally do an excellent job exposing their students to volunteering and altruistic pursuits in their local and the wider communities. I must say it's something I've seen emphasised in every school that we've visited, whether via programs that, for example, bring the youngsters into close contact with seniors at nearby centres, or planting trees for land care, or as St John's trainees, for example. I just want to add that in modern times, although the role's always been explained in those three main parts of constitutional, ceremonial and community, there is a fourth and significant part of the role, and that is in promoting every aspect of Victoria's international engagement. Victoria simply can't flourish if it's isolated from trade, investment, culture, innovation, and importantly, collaboration with the wider world. In a disrupted environment, innovation is absolutely key, and to succeed in a globalised economy, it must be on a global basis. I must say we've just returned by a day from India, and we were fortunate in Bangalore to hold a roundtable of some of that nation's most brilliant young innovators and entrepreneurs. And if ever you needed convincing that a global outlook is what would stand you in good stead, you only need to look at those young people from Bangalore, where it's the engine room of the innovation that is just making India the power that it is and will be. And with 400 million young people to educate, these are important things to be thinking about. It is, I must say, through our community and our international engagement that I've most recently been exposed to and contemplated aspects of education previously less known to me. In late 2015, I had the privilege to meet with and listen to researchers at the OECD in Paris, discussing how countries around the world were rated on different aspects of education. This is not new news to any of the educators in the room. You're probably well familiar with the figures and the processes of the OECD. They described to us that Australia's rating was high when it came to the equipment available to its school children. And it stands to reason, of course, we're a relatively wealthy country. And although we may lament a lack of perfect school infrastructure across the board, and we can always keep working to improve it, we are overall comparatively well off in these regards. And yet, we're not ranked commensurately at the top of the international results. It was explained to me, or to us, and as many of you again in this room would readily understand, a pretty complex equation, and there are many factors at play. Certainly, the skill of the teachers is considered an essential element when it comes to the educational results of a nation. Equipment can always add to the learning process, but it's unlikely to ever supplant the primary learning model of teacher and student. The importance of teacher training is not something that I need to emphasise in this setting, and how lucky are we in Victoria that we have this wonderful graduate school and other wonderful places too where our teachers are so well trained. I know that in Victorian schools we're blessed with fine teachers and many outstanding examples of teaching methodologies, and I'm sure the views on methodologies will differ markedly. So from a layman's perspective, I emphasise, let me just mention an inspiring example of the impact of exciting, engaging and engaged teaching that I saw at Warana Primary School in Dandenong. The little children from Warana sang in our ballroom at my inauguration. I knew nothing about them or about the school, but they sang so sweetly and they were such lovely kids. I asked if I could go and visit the school soon after. I was struck first by the leadership in that school. Long-time Principal Ray Trotter was a facilitator for his teaching staff. He enabled them to incorporate technology into non-traditional classrooms in order to facilitate the children's self-directed learning. Even though it wasn't his strong suit, he actually enabled the teachers who did have the skills to do that. It was clear, though, that the children's self-directed learning was skillfully guided by the teachers who were fully engaged with each student. Students chose what they wanted to study, they set their own educational challenges, and they met them through cross-curriculum and collaborative study groups across the age groups. I was particularly taken by one grade 5 boy. Recently arrived in Australia, he told me that his research was about the guinea worm. When I asked why he'd chosen that as his learning area, he explained he'd been motivated by the suffering he'd seen in South Sudan, but he told me he was absolutely confident that he would go on to study medicine at university. It was interesting for me because in 2009, I now know, Deakin University recognised the Warana Primary School Principal's approach with the opening of the flexible learning space named in his honour, the Raymond Trotter Flexible Learning Space, a centre designed to give student teachers more classroom teaching experience, but also and importantly to challenge the traditional methods of education. And can I say, again, emphasising that I don't have the skills that so many of you have here, rather than advocating that particular methodology, I'm simply saying how impressive it was to see a different methodology being tried. And there are no doubt many different methodologies. They all depend on the teacher-student relationship ultimately, but I like the exploration of the different ways of approaching it. That actually leads me neatly to the next great fortune I had when last year I was privileged to visit the Sutton Trust and the Education Endowment Foundation as part of an official visit to London. Now, those organisations are jointly designated as the UK Cabinet's What Works Centre on Educational Achievement. Again, I'm sure that those in academia know well about the What Works Centre. Their remit is to run randomised control tests and specifically design pilot projects to generate evidence of what works to improve educational outcomes for children, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Every test and every project is independently evaluated. with all the results made publicly available, in order to identify ineffective interventions and effective interventions, and then to scale up the effective interventions. What was interesting to me, as someone untrained in the area, was to see some of what would popularly be accepted as fact being tested. For example, that smaller class sizes or more homework could in themselves be the answer or part of the answer to better outcomes. Instead of relying on such assumptions, a teaching and learning toolkit has been devised. So it assists schools to evaluate their programs by measuring the average impact on attainment, the strength of the evidence supporting them, and the cost. So it's not just looking for effective solutions, but cost-effective solutions too. And in that way, the best use of limited resources based on well-informed discussions can be ensured. We're no different from the UK. Obviously, we need to find the most cost-effective ways of looking after our young people's education too. I want to turn now briefly to the teaching of STEM, because you'd expect that I would, and of course I would. When it comes to equipping our children for the future, there's probably no discussion now that doesn't include talking about science, technology, engineering and maths. This is not unique to Victoria or Australia. In India, as I said, where we've just been, one of the leading scientists in Delhi described to us that STEM was, as he put it, every Indian parent's idea of the best passport to give to their children. My view is it's not much different in Australia. I still think it's the best passport that you can give. Coming from a humanities background, I'm not saying we should cut out the humanities, but I do think we need to augment STEM studies. I feel guilty that until recent years, I didn't even think a great deal about STEM. I don't mean I thought badly of it, I just didn't think of it. But I'm probably just a product of my generation. And in my time at school, we were channelled, as I mentioned or hinted at earlier, we were simply channelled into the areas where we showed some natural aptitude. My interest in and enthusiasm for reading and writing were encouraged and nurtured by positive teachers and positive reinforcement, and then by the sound results that inevitably follow from that wonderful mixture of encouragement. I can't say that I was actively discouraged from studying science, but I wasn't dissuaded from an early lack of interest in studying science, if you understand the difference. Neither by exciting teaching, nor by any redirection as to the importance of pursuing those areas of study for a well-rounded education. And certainly, I don't remember anyone ever saying to me, but do you realise that science will tell you how the whole world works? Which I've only discovered at a very late stage. I still don't understand it, but I understand why it matters. I'm not critical of my school, my teachers, or even my parents, or even self-critical for pursuing such a narrow course of learning. I am, as I keep saying, a product of those times, and in the 1960s, I know it's hard to believe, I was going to fare perfectly well in a narrow and linear career in, as it turned out, the law. It is interesting for me because we're both lawyers, our children are both lawyers. We both had the sort of linear careers that were expected in our age. Neither of our children are practising law at this stage, even though they're qualified. And that is the difference, of course, that we see. Of course, in my day too, it was the norm for the majority of girls to pursue the arts rather than the sciences. Times have changed dramatically in what I can't believe is almost half of a century since I was choosing subjects at school. But we do know in Victoria, a state without vast mineral resources upon which we can rely, and a state in which we can no longer depend on traditional manufacturing processes, that we will simply be left behind if our students are not equipped for what's referred to as the fourth industrial revolution, or what is called in some quarters Industry 4.0. We know how the workforce has changed, is changing, and will need to keep changing. And we know too, as I'm sure is familiar to most of you here, that a school leaver today is likely to have as many as 17 different employers in their lifetimes and up to 5 different careers, and that the national average tenure of a job is now less than 3.5 years. If we're looking at changes, research from the Committee of Economic Development of Australia tells us too that there is a high probability that 40% of Australia's workforce could be replaced by automation in 10 to 20 years' time. Even judges. When they first spoke of replacing judges with computers in any sense, for example, getting them to decide the splitting up of property in the family court, we laughed and scoffed as if a computer could ever do that. Well, we do know that there is a capacity for cognitive computing that's been developed and is improving. And it's bound to impact on the likes of company audits, tax advice, discovery and conveyancing. It is most unlikely to bypass court decision making in the future. Feed in the data and feed out the answer. Most decisions do need a little more by way of human observation and discretion. Some don't. And in any event, the sort of artificial intelligence that's being developed and refined will have more and more capacity for discretion. When it comes to a changing workforce, we must also remember that it's projected that 65% of today's students will be employed in jobs that don't yet exist, and that 75% of the fastest growing occupations will require skills and knowledge in STEM. And there's no doubt about that. Again, in India, the delightful moment for us when we were with the young innovators was that they're the ones who are just on the cusp of this extraordinary explosion of innovative skill in India. And they were telling us very honestly that each one of them, when they told their parents that they were going into some entrepreneurial role, their parents were horrified that they weren't going to just join the public service. They said that now parents are horrified when the kids say they're going to join the public service. That every parent wants their child to be an entrepreneur. So that's how times change and probably reflect what's going to keep changing. I have always been impressed with Catherine Livingstone's comments in this area when she was the chair of the Business Council of Australia, when she called for Australia to recognise what she called suboptimal performance in teaching STEM and computer literacy. She advocated a greater emphasis in primary and senior school on the STEM topics, quite simply in order to enhance employability in the fastest growing occupations. We do see changes in our schools. We do see changes in our teaching in these areas, and they're encouraging. But I think everyone would agree there's still much work to be done, particularly with girls. We know that only about 16% of STEM qualified Australians are women. For all the reasons that I've given as to why Victoria can't be left behind, we can't afford to draw on only 50% of our talent pool. There's a huge cause for celebration right here at the University of Melbourne, and that is that this university is the home of the Science Gallery. The Science Gallery is one of a small network of science galleries around the world. It started in Trinity College Dublin with some funding contributed by Google. It is now being set up in King's College London, and the third one is here at the University of Melbourne. Pretty good company to be keeping. The next one is at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, for the reasons I've said, very fertile ground for this sort of gallery. And the next is at Ca' Foscari University in Venice, and in Detroit at Michigan State University. This is a gallery designed specifically for 15 to 25-year-olds to teach them not about STEM, but about STEAM, about science, technology, engineering, the arts and mathematics. It's to help them recognise the inevitable creative collisions that can occur between the arts and the sciences. What a huge feather in the cap of this university it is, and Victoria too, to be part of this elite network. Now, although we don't yet have the physical space for the Science Gallery actually set up, it's going to be where I gave birth to our children, the Royal Women's Hospital site. I always think that when I'm doing something for the Science Gallery. It's going to be a bit different then. It's going to have an amazing front onto Swanston and Grattan Streets. And although it's not yet finished, the first exhibition, called Blood, Attract and Repel, is already underway. And it models the best of international collaborations because it includes work from the Science Gallery Dublin on the same theme, and there's actually simultaneous programming with King's College in London. So promising that it would prompt us to consider what it means to be human, to be infected, to be other, to smell, bleed, feel, taste, listen, pump, pulse and learn. That's a quote, I couldn't have made it up. It didn't disappoint. There is, for example, a room called Pulse Index. It's a biometric installation that records the participants' fingerprints and heart rates at the same time. So visitors place their finger into a custom-made sensor equipped with a digital microscope and a pulsimeter. Pulsimeter? Pulsimeter. The data for the last 10,295 participants is recorded and displayed so that you stand in a room wrapped in what looks like a skin-covered spiral. If that doesn't make young people excited about science and the artistry of science, then nothing will. The University of Melbourne's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Glyn Davis, succinctly described the beauty of such cross-disciplinary study when he said, "When science and art collide, the light produced helps us see better the challenges we face. Leonardo da Vinci recognised this power, achieved when two divergent disciplines strike against each other." And he continued, "The result can be a crucible of creativity to inspire interest, propel engagement and encourage research." I agree, and I think that it's time perhaps to revisit scientist and novelist C.P. Snow's famous Two Cultures essay, delivered almost 6 decades ago now. Snow argued that to further the progress of human knowledge and to benefit society, practitioners in the arts and the sciences had to build bridges to ensure that the cultural divide between them was crossed. I mentioned polymaths a little earlier. Think of Leonardo da Vinci, as Professor Davis mentioned. Painter, sculptor, architect, musician, scientist, mathematician, engineer, inventor, geologist, cartographer, botanist and writer. Think of what his multidisciplinary genius gave to the world. I think we need, in a complex world, to see more of that. Finally, as Governor, I have really seen and come to understand the importance of international education. First, it is Victoria's biggest service export industry. At the end of last year, we had more than 220,000 international students studying in Victoria. And we rank in the top 5 cities in the world for international student experience. So we are with Montreal, Paris, London and Seoul in Korea. And we are well equipped for our international students. First, obviously, being voted the world's most livable city for the 7th consecutive year. And I should just pause there to say, I think in Melbourne we're a little world weary about that. There's lots of discussions to have as to all working hard to make sure it's livable for everybody. That's one aspect. But the other is we tend to recite it because year after year we receive it and it's, oh, again, we're the world's most livable city. But on this recent official visit, there wasn't one official in the other country who didn't introduce us by mentioning that because they thought it was such an extraordinary accomplishment. And of course, what's important about it is that our emphasis on education is very much part of that livability. I'm always quick to point out that livability doesn't just mean we have a pretty city. Certainly the planning, the urban design, the grid layout of the centre of the city is attractive. Certainly the beautiful green and the parklands also in the centre of the city is attractive. But livability means healthcare, education, infrastructure, water management, air quality, some things which I think we take for granted, and particularly just having come from cities that struggle with their air quality. We are very, very fortunate indeed. But let me just say this about international education because I've reflected on it a lot in the course of the work we do here and overseas. It is about so much more than exports. It opens up opportunities for international collaboration, opportunities that are essential for our future well-being. In our schools, we see networks of sister schools where young people are able to communicate with and undertake studies with their contemporaries in other countries. And it's delightful. In fact, every year we have a number of receptions, but one of them is for the little ones from our sister province in China, Jiangsu. And we have half the room filled with young Jiangsu kids and half filled with young Victorian kids. And of course, the Victorians stand up and at that sort of size speak what sounds like fluent Mandarin to me. It sounds very good. And of course, the little kids who are visiting stand up and say the most delightful things in perfect English. We see that and it's great. But nowhere is this collaboration more important than it is in universities. I've referred to the example of the science galleries that bring together arts and science for young people. I know I'm speaking at the University of Melbourne, but I know that we're a broad church here in Victoria, and we are very lucky indeed that our 10 universities are of such a high calibre. I mean, 2 are in the top 100 and 2 are probably in the top 5 in the Asia-Pacific region in biomedical areas, but our 10 universities are very, very highly ranked and very widely renowned. I've recently seen at Swinburne the most beautiful example of collaboration. It's at their design factory, where they bring together students, research leaders, industry partners and entrepreneurs to solve the most complex design problems and to generate innovative solutions to them. So this one, the design factory started in Helsinki at Aalto University, and there's now a design factory global network with centres in places like China and Chile and Portugal and the Netherlands. It's a radical new approach to teaching design because the students actually work together across national borders and boundaries on real-life problems. So it might be solving the problem for Finnair or another airline on how to package their food better in a way that will fit more units into an aircraft, and they do that together as part of their degree. Monash University has a magnificent collaboration, for example, with Suzhou in Victoria's sister state of Jiangsu that I just mentioned. They actually have a university there that they share with the Southeast University. It's situated in the Suzhou Industrial Park, which is home to almost 3,500 international companies, including more than 100 Fortune 500 companies, and truly one of the most dynamic hubs that you could go to in the world. It's described as a hub of 21st century brain power. And our postdoctoral students, or slightly below that actually, can go there and achieve degrees in high-level bio and nanotechnology. They do joint research all the way through their studies. Deakin, of course, has had this amazing success with Greg LeMond and the agreement they've struck with him, a 3-time Tour de France winner, the founder of Le Monde Composites. They've created the composite that Le Monde is going to use under licence, Carbon Nexus, so that the bikes are lighter and, I suppose, faster. You can tell I'm not a cyclist. But I am an enthusiast for the fact that this is a commercialisation of a brilliant idea from Deakin, and it's hoped that the manufacturing will also take place in Victoria. I could go on and you'll be so relieved to hear that I won't, because every single one of our universities has a full range of programs like that. So I was just trying to be very fair and equitable by referring to some universities other than the University of Melbourne, so I'm sure I'll be forgiven for that, but the list goes on and on. The upshot of all this is twofold. First, our students are learning the worth of collaboration. Remember, I was a lawyer. Collaboration was never my forte because we were in an adversarial setting of a courtroom. So realising that collaboration is the key to almost any success has come to me quite late, and I'm a zealot about it now because I've not seen any of our brilliant research institutes or any of our universities or any of our businesses or policymakers who would say anything other than that they cannot succeed and they cannot flourish unless they collaborate with other parties. It is certainly the only key to conquering the big issues that will face us all. But the other reason why I wanted to talk to you today about international education is that our children, our youngsters, just simply need to be educated as global citizens. In this role, I see many of the thousands of students not only coming to Melbourne to study, but we have the privilege and the joy too of often seeing our Victorian students when they're studying in other places. And what we see is young people who are learning about each other, discovering the differences, discovering how to do business, have personal relationships, transact, study and share across any cultural boundaries. They're all our future global citizens, and their international exposure is absolutely essential to our well-being. So that brings me to the very end. What I wanted to leave you with is this. Victoria's state motto, I'm not sure how many of you know it off by hand, I'm not going to test you, but Victoria's state motto is peace and prosperity. I always interpret that widely, well beyond peace just meaning that we won't fight or disagree, and well beyond prosperity simply meaning wealth for everyone. I think that for true peace and prosperity to be shared by us all, we all depend on the transformative nature of education. I think that peace is enhanced when the barriers of fear are broken down, when we learn more about each other, we study side by side, and we come to see and appreciate each other's strengths, and also come to learn that we have more in common than we have that keeps us apart. And I think that prosperity is better assured when everyone shares in the opportunities of a lucky country, and nothing could be luckier than an environment where education is valued and every child is offered equal access. And I have to say that it's because of that conviction that I was prepared to share what I know tonight is simply a layman's observations of education in our state, but I was prepared to take the risk of turning up because I think it's so important. Thank you, and I wish you all peace and prosperity. Thank you.